For 7 years, Thomas Brennan believed Maple Grove Avenue was the safest place in his life. It was a street designed to disappear into the background. Trimmed lawns, identical mailboxes, cars that came and went on predictable schedules. The kind of neighborhood where nothing truly happened, and that was precisely the point. After long days at Langley, after hours spent dissecting fragments of intercepted conversations and coded transmissions, Thomas needed a place where his mind could finally power down. This was supposed to be that place. Every morning followed the same ritual. Coffee brewed at 6:30, the radio murmuring about international tensions without ever naming the real dangers. Sarah upstairs getting ready for her shift at the hospital. Emma laughing in the backyard, chasing leaves or kicking a ball against the fence. Normal life, carefully protected normal life. And next door, William Norton, the perfect neighbor. Quiet, polite, reliable, always ready with a small wave when their paths crossed. His lawn never overgrown, his hedges always trimmed to regulation height. The sort of man people trusted instinctively, precisely because there was nothing memorable about him. Thomas had never once questioned him. At least, not consciously. It was a Tuesday morning in October when the first hairline crack appeared in that certainty. Thomas stood at the kitchen window, coffee warming his hands, watching Emma dart between piles of fallen leaves. His eyes drifted, unfocused, the way they often did when his mind was half elsewhere. That was when he saw Norton, standing in his own backyard, completely still. Not stretching, not checking his phone, just standing there near the fence line, his body held in a way that made something in Thomas's chest tighten. There was an unnatural rigidity to him, a posture Thomas recognized before he had time to name it. Military bearing. The kind that never truly fades, no matter how many years a person spends pretending to be ordinary. Norton was staring down at something in his hand. Small, precise. Whatever it was, he examined it with intense focus, as if the rest of the world had briefly ceased to exist. Thomas watched for only a few seconds, yet those seconds stretched uncomfortably long. Then Norton slipped the object into his pocket, turned, and walked back inside his house. The moment passed. Thomas told himself he was projecting, that this was what happened when you spent too many years in intelligence. You learned to see patterns everywhere, even where none existed. At Langley, paranoia was a survival skill. In suburbia, it was a liability. This was home, the one place he was supposed to let his guard down. And so he did. Or at least, he tried to.
2 weeks later, an asset in Moscow went silent. Thomas sat in a windowless office, surrounded by scattered briefing folders and half-empty coffee cups, staring at a single line of text that refused to let go of his attention. Signals intelligence from Eastern Europe. Fragmented transmissions. An abrupt stop where there should have been noise. Compromised. That was the word floating through the building that day, spoken quietly, carefully. Someone had been exposed. Someone had made a mistake. Or someone had been betrayed. Thomas scanned the report again, his fatigue blurring the words. Then he reached a detail that made him stop entirely. The last communication referenced a dead drop, an old technique, a colored chalk mark on a mailbox. Blue. Thomas leaned back in his chair, the memory surfacing uninvited. 3 houses down from his own. A faint blue streak he'd noticed that morning while walking Emma to the bus stop. He had barely registered it at the time. Kids played on the street. Mailboxes got scratched. Chalk marks meant nothing. Except now they did. Coincidence, he told himself. That was all it was. A trick of an overworked mind connecting unrelated dots. Still, the image followed him home that night, riding in the passenger seat of his car like an unwelcome guest. At dinner, Sarah noticed. "You're not really here," she said gently, reaching across the table for his hand. "Just tired," Thomas replied, forcing a smile that felt foreign on his face. But the truth was, he had started to notice things. Small things, the kind that meant nothing on their own. Norton's car gone for days at a time, then present without explanation. Visitors who arrived without warning and left exactly 15 minutes later. Always different faces. Always efficient. No lingering conversations on the porch. Thomas tried to stop watching. He failed.
By November, his attention had sharpened into something closer to obsession. He found himself mapping routines without intended, tracking patterns without writing them down. The way Norton never received mail on Tuesdays, the way his trash contained nothing personal, no bills, no bank statements, no discarded pieces of a real life. And then there was the running. Thomas saw Norton one morning at 5 a.m., dressed for exercise, walking down the street without ever breaking into a jog. He paused at that same mailbox, touched the post briefly, a gesture so small it could easily be dismissed as stretching or habit. But Thomas knew better. Signal check. That was the phrase that surfaced in his mind, cold and precise, a professional instinct he had spent years trying to suppress outside the office. Still, doubt followed immediately after. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe he was finally doing the things Sarah had warned him about, letting the job bleed into everything until the world became a web of imagined conspiracies. He promised himself he would stop. Then he did something he knew he shouldn't. He logged in. The secure laptop felt heavier than usual when he opened it in his home office. Running background checks on civilians without cause was forbidden. Running one on a neighbor was worse. William Norton, age 52, Maple Grove Avenue. The result was flawless. Employment history, clean credit, tax records, community involvement, even a minor speeding ticket, as if to prove no life was truly perfect. Everything fit, everything aligned. And that was the problem. Real lives were messy. They leaked. They contradicted themselves. Norton's didn't. Thomas stared at the screen long after midnight, the quiet house pressing in around him. Somewhere down the hall, Sarah slept. Emma breathed softly in her room. The life he was supposed to protect. And next door, a man whose existence felt too complete to be real. For the first time, Thomas Brennan allowed himself to consider a thought he had been resisting for weeks. What if the danger wasn't overseas anymore? What if it was living right beside him, hiding behind trimmed hedges and polite smiles, waiting patiently for the right moment to move?
Thomas stopped sleeping properly after that. Not because of nightmares, because his mind refused to shut down. He would lie awake beside Sarah, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet breathing of his family. Every sound in the house felt louder than it should. The ticking clock in the hallway, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant rush of a car passing somewhere far away. Normal sounds, safe sounds, yet his body stayed tense, as if waiting for something to break the silence. At work, he made mistakes, small ones, a missed detail in a report, a delayed response to an email. Things no one else noticed, but Thomas did. He had built his career on precision, on catching what others overlooked. Now his focus fractured without warning. He found himself watching reflections in glass doors, checking who walked behind him in corridors, pausing before opening secure files, as if someone might already be watching. That frightened him more than Norton ever had. One evening, Sarah confronted him. "You're not okay," she said. Not accusing, just stating a fact. They were standing in the kitchen. Emma was already asleep. The house felt too quiet again. "I'm fine," Thomas replied automatically. Sarah didn't argue. That was worse. She studied his face, the dark circles under his eyes, the tension he couldn't hide. "You don't lie well," she said softly. "Not to me." Thomas wanted to tell her everything. The mailbox, the visitors, the feeling that something was wrong. But intelligence work taught you one rule early. The less people know, the safer they are. So he said nothing. That night, he opened the laptop again. He told himself this would be the last time. Just one more check, one more confirmation that he was wrong. He wasn't. He went deeper this time, past the surface records, past the databases he used every day. He accessed systems that required higher clearance, systems he was authorized to touch for work, but not for this. The results came back clean, too clean. Every document aligned perfectly, every date matched, every address checked out. William Norton existed on paper in a way that felt manufactured, like a model life built to survive scrutiny. Thomas leaned back in his chair. In real investigations, perfection was a red flag. He searched for gaps.
At first, he found nothing. Then he noticed it. A 6-month stretch, 15 years earlier, officially listed as between positions. No employer, no explanation. 6 months. He cross-referenced the dates. His pulse quickened. That period overlapped with a string of compromised assets in Eastern Europe, 3 of them, all burned quietly, all traced back to internal leaks that were never fully explained. Thomas pulled the old reports. He read them slowly, carefully. One of the compromised assets had been a walk-in, someone who had approached CIA officers at a conference in Geneva. The intelligence provided had been sensitive, verified through internal channels that passed through Langley. Thomas froze. He searched again. This time, not for Norton, for himself. His personnel file loaded in seconds. He scanned it once, then again. Something was wrong. According to the record, 15 years ago, Thomas Brennan had been assigned to signals analysis at Langley during the exact period those assets were compromised. Thomas stared at the screen. That was impossible. He had been overseas then, on his first foreign posting. He remembered the apartment, the streets, the language he barely spoke at the time. Those memories were solid, anchored. Yet the file said otherwise. Someone had edited it. Someone had placed him inside a narrative that didn't belong to him, a narrative that made him look like the source of the leaks. Cold realization settled over him. This wasn't paranoia. This was preparation. Someone was building a case, slowly, carefully. The kind of case that didn't need proof, just plausibility. And suddenly, Norton made sense in a way Thomas didn't want to accept. Not just a spy, a mirror, a distraction. Thomas closed the laptop and sat in the dark. If he reported Norton, Internal Affairs would open his file. They would see the altered records. They would stop looking next door and start looking at him. If he stayed silent, the noose would keep tightening. Either way, he lost. For the first time in his career, Thomas Brennan felt truly trapped, not by an enemy he could identify, but by a system that could be turned against him without ever raising its voice. And somewhere beyond the thin walls of his house, beyond the neat hedges and quiet streetlights, William Norton slept peacefully, or pretended to. Thomas didn't know which possibility scared him more. Thomas decided to stop thinking like an analyst. Analysts collected data, they waited, they reported. That approach would destroy him. From this point forward, he needed to think like someone who assumed they were already compromised. He started small. He changed his routine, left for work at different times, took different streets home, parked farther from the house, and walked the last block. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would draw attention, just enough to see if anyone noticed. Someone did. Not immediately, but subtly. One evening, as Thomas pulled into the driveway later than usual, he noticed Norton standing near his garage, not doing anything in particular, just there, as if he had stepped outside for air at the exact right moment. They exchanged nods. Normal, harmless, but Thomas felt it, that familiar sensation from years in the field, the sense of being acknowledged without being addressed. That night, Thomas installed the camera. It was old equipment, something he had signed out years ago for a training exercise and never returned. Motion activated, silent, the kind designed to blend into the background. He mounted it in the attic window. It had a clear view of Norton's driveway and front door. If Norton was active, Thomas needed a record. The footage started accumulating quickly. Late departures, early returns, always alone. Then came the pattern. Tuesday and Thursday, 7:15 in the evening, Norton left the house carrying a small leather briefcase, always the same one, scuffed at the corners, ordinary enough to be ignored. He returned just before 10, the briefcase lighter. Thomas watched the footage again and again. He documented everything, dates, times, durations. But patterns weren't proof, so he followed him. The lie to Sarah came easily, too easily. He hated himself for that more than the surveillance. Norton drove calmly, confidently, not like someone afraid of being followed. That worried Thomas more than anything else. They ended up at a diner. Old, chrome-sided, timeless in the worst way. Thomas waited. Nothing happened. Then the other man arrived. The exchange was flawless. Too fast for coincidence. too smooth for chance. Thomas took photos. Bad ones, grainy, inconclusive. But he had seen enough. Back home, he searched the man's face. David Kramer, State Department analyst. Access, debt, pressure. The perfect recruitment profile. Thomas felt the board expanding beneath his feet. This was no longer one piece out of place. It was a system. And systems didn't form by accident.
The break came with the holiday party, an opportunity disguised as tradition. When Norton left his house, Thomas moved. The lock surrendered faster than it should have. Inside, the house felt wrong, too clean, too intentional. He searched carefully, methodically. Then he found the books, the photo, the microfilm, the passport. Yuri Vulov. Proof. Real proof. That was when the footsteps started. Thomas didn't reach for the gun right away. That delay saved his life. Norton didn't panic, didn't shout. He spoke calmly, like someone who had been waiting for this moment. What followed was not a confrontation. It was a negotiation. And worse, a revelation. Someone else was moving pieces. Someone higher, closer. Someone who could edit CIA personnel files without triggering alarms. Norton wasn't framing him. Someone was framing both of them. By the time Thomas left the house, nothing felt solid anymore. Enemy, ally, institution. The lines had collapsed. At the party, laughter filled the room. Glasses clinked. Children ran through hallways. Thomas stood among them, smiling when required. But he was already somewhere else, planning. Because one truth had become clear. This was no longer about exposure. It was about survival. And survival meant doing the unthinkable, working with the man next door. Thomas did not sleep at all that night, not even for a moment. He lay in bed beside Sarah, staring into the dark, replaying every word Norton had spoken, every pause, every look. Norton had not sounded like a man cornered. He had sounded like a man relieved. That detail mattered. People under threat behaved in predictable ways. They denied, they deflected, they threatened. Norton had done none of those things. He had offered information, and that made Thomas uneasy in a way fear never could.
By morning, Thomas understood something else. If Norton was telling the truth, then the danger was no longer hypothetical. Someone inside the system had already chosen a narrative, and that narrative ended with Thomas Brennan taking the fall. That meant time was no longer on his side. At work, he said very little. He listened more than usual, watched faces during briefings, paid attention to who asked questions and who didn't. He noticed which names surfaced repeatedly in internal emails, which divisions suddenly showed interest in cases they had ignored for years. Nothing concrete, but enough to confirm one thing. The machine had started to turn. That afternoon, he received an automated notification. Routine, easy to overlook. An internal audit had been scheduled. His division, his access logs. Nothing unusual on the surface, except timing was never accidental. Thomas left the office early. He didn't go home. Instead, he parked several blocks away and walked, slowly, casually. He entered his house through the back, just in case. Norton's curtains were drawn. That night, Thomas made a decision he never thought he would make. He wrote everything down. Not on a computer, not digitally, on paper. Dates, observations, altered records, the diner, Kramer, the passport, Norton's claims about a third player. He didn't know who would eventually read it, or if anyone ever would. But if he disappeared, if he was silenced, the truth needed somewhere to exist. He hid the notebook carefully. Then he waited. The first sign came 2 days later. His access privileges changed. Not revoked, not suspended, adjusted. Subtle enough to seem administrative, but Thomas noticed. He always noticed. Someone was narrowing his view. That evening, Norton knocked on his door. It was the first time in 7 years. Sarah answered. She smiled, invited him in. Thomas watched from the hallway. Norton looked like any other neighbor, relaxed, friendly, concerned. "I just wanted to check in," Norton said. "You've seemed stressed lately." A performance, for Sarah. Thomas nodded, played his part. "Work," he said. "You know how it is." Norton met his eyes for half-second longer than necessary. Message received. Later that night, Thomas stepped into his backyard. Norton was already there, standing near the fence. They didn't greet each other. They didn't need to. "They're tightening around you," Norton said quietly. "I know," Thomas replied. "Good. That means we still have time." "Time for what?" Norton didn't answer right away. "To force their hand," he said finally. "To make them move before they're ready." Thomas exhaled slowly. That was dangerous, reckless. It meant escalation. It also meant clarity. "Whoever is doing this," Norton continued, "they're confident. That's a weakness. They believe you're isolated, that you'll act alone." Thomas looked at the dark outline of the houses around them, at the quiet street that had once felt safe. "They're right," he said. Norton turned toward him. "No," Thomas added. "They're wrong, because I'm not acting at all." Norton frowned. "I'm reacting," Thomas said, "exactly the way they expect." Silence stretched between them. Then Norton smiled, not warmly, but with respect. "You're learning," he said.
Over the next week, Thomas played the role written for him. He made mistakes on purpose, missed meetings, submitted reports late, let irritation show in his voice. He let colleagues see stress instead of control. Inside the system, perception mattered more than truth, and Thomas was shaping his. At the same time, Norton moved quietly, carefully, using channels Thomas didn't fully understand, old ones, dangerous ones. David Kramer stopped answering his phone. 2 days later, Kramer vanished from the office, officially reassigned, no explanation. Another piece removed from the board. The audit arrived sooner than expected, internal security, polite, clinical, smiling. They asked Thomas to explain discrepancies in his past assignments. He did, calmly, clearly. They listened, took notes. They said nothing. That was worse. That night, Thomas realized the final truth. This was not about spies. Not really. It was about control. About who could rewrite reality and who would be crushed by it. And if he wanted to survive, he would have to do something irreversible. Something that would ensure the game could not simply continue without consequences. Standing at the window, watching the dark outline of Norton's house, Thomas Brennan understood that the quiet street was gone forever. What replaced it was a battlefield, silent, invisible, and already active. The next move did not come from Thomas. It came from the system. 3 days after the audit, his badge failed at the east entrance. Just once, a brief red flash, then green. The guard barely noticed. Thomas did. Later that morning, an email arrived. Calm, neutral, routine language. A mandatory security recertification interview, scheduled for the following week. Attendance required. That was the warning shot. They were not ready to accuse him yet, but they were preparing the ground. Thomas did not tell Sarah. He kept routines normal. Ate dinner, helped Emma with homework, read her a story before bed. His voice stayed steady. He made sure of that, because panic was contagious. That night he met Norton again by the fence. "This is accelerating," Thomas said. Norton nodded. "They've committed. That means they've exposed themselves." "Or they're confident," Thomas replied. "Confidence and exposure are the same thing," Norton said. "Eventually." Thomas watched the dark windows of nearby houses. Anyone could be listening, or no one. Both possibilities were equally dangerous. "We need proof," Thomas said. "Not of you, not of me, of them." Norton was silent for a long moment. "There is one way," he said. "But once we start, there is no retreat." "There already isn't," Thomas replied. The plan was simple, which made it terrifying. They would feed the system something it could not ignore, something too precise to dismiss, something that would force senior oversight to intervene. Not an accusation, a contradiction. Norton explained it carefully, slowly, using language Thomas hadn't heard since training. A controlled leak, not to the press, not to a foreign service, to the system itself. Thomas would introduce a fragment of false intelligence, something small, something believable, something that only one internal pathway can touch. If that fragment resurfaced, altered, misdirected, or prematurely flagged, they would know exactly where the manipulation lived. And so would everyone else. "This is how you flush ghosts," Norton said. Thomas understood the risk immediately. If it failed, the leak would trace back to him, and this time the narrative would stick. They waited 2 days. Then Thomas acted. At work, he accessed a dormant file, a Cold War relic, an operation long closed and rarely referenced. He inserted a single annotation, one sentence, carefully worded, easy to misinterpret. Then he logged out. He said nothing. He waited. 48 hours later, the fragment reappeared, but not where it should have. It surfaced in a restricted briefing circulated to a small circle of senior officials. The language had changed, the implication sharpened. The false intelligence now pointed toward a live counterintelligence concern. Someone had touched it. Someone with authority. Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest. They had their proof. Norton confirmed it that night. His contacts had detected unusual internal traffic. Names were moving, permissions shifting. They took the bait, Norton said. And now, Thomas asked, what happens to me? Norton looked at him. Now, he said, you become dangerous. The following morning, Thomas was pulled from his desk. 2 men, professional, calm, internal security. They asked him to come with them. He did. The interview room was small, windowless, familiar. He had sat on the other side of that table many times. Now he was the subject. They asked about his past assignments, about inconsistencies, about foreign contacts. Thomas answered honestly. That was the most unsettling part. Halfway through the interview, a third person entered the room. Older, higher rank, less patient. The questions changed. Sharper, more focused. They mentioned the altered fragment. Thomas had nothing. Then the room shifted. A phone rang. The older man answered it. Listened. His expression tightened. He ended the call without a word. The interview stopped. Thomas was escorted out. Not detained. Not cleared. Suspended in a space worse than both. At home, Sarah sensed it immediately. You're in trouble, she said. Yes, Thomas replied. Is it serious? Yes. That was all he gave her. That night, Norton did not appear by the fence. That absence worried Thomas more than any threat. Near midnight, Thomas received a message. Not digital, not traceable. A slip of paper slid under his door. 1 sentence. They know it wasn't you. They don't know who it is yet. Thomas sat on the floor, the paper shaking slightly in his hand. The system had paused. Not because it was merciful, but because it was confused. And confusion in this world was opportunity. He stood slowly, looked down the quiet hallway toward his daughter's room, toward the life he was trying to keep intact. This was no longer about clearing his name. It was about ending the game, before the game ended him.
Thomas understood something important the next morning. The system had not stopped. It had hesitated. That hesitation meant power was shifting somewhere above him. Quiet arguments, closed-door meetings, senior people asking questions they did not like asking. When institutions became uncertain, they became dangerous. Thomas stayed home that day. Officially, he was on administrative leave. Unofficially, he was waiting. He cleaned the kitchen, folded laundry, helped Emma with a puzzle on the living room floor. Every normal action felt surreal. Outside, Maple Grove Avenue looked the same. Cars parked neatly, leaves gathered along the curb. Nothing suggested that forces far larger than this street were grinding against each other. Shortly after noon, Norton appeared. Not at the fence, at the front door. Thomas saw him through the window before Sarah did. Their eyes met. Norton did not wave. That alone told Thomas everything. He stepped outside before Sarah could ask questions. They walked together without speaking, past hedges, past driveways, toward the small park at the end of the street where no one ever went during the day. Only when they reached the benches did Norton speak. They're splitting, Norton said. Who? Thomas asked. Control and containment, Norton replied. 2 factions. One wants to bury this quietly. The other wants a scapegoat before it grows. Thomas nodded. And which one wins? Norton looked at him. That depends on how useful you remain. Thomas exhaled slowly. So I'm still a piece. Yes, Norton said, but now you're a visible one. They sat in silence. Children's laughter drifted faintly from somewhere far away. Life continued, unaware. There's something you haven't told me, Thomas said. Norton did not deny it. There is, he said. Norton leaned forward. The person altering your file isn't Russian, and they're not working for any foreign service. Thomas turned toward him. They're internal, Norton continued. Career counterintelligence. They've been chasing a ghost for years, a mole that may not even exist anymore. And they chose me, Thomas said. They chose proximity, Norton replied. You were near me. You fit.
And once the narrative starts, truth becomes irrelevant. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. Then this never ends, he said. No, Norton agreed. It escalates. The escalation came that night. 2 cars parked across the street. Unmarked, engines off, lights dark. Surveillance. Not subtle, not hidden, deliberate. Thomas watched from the window while Sarah put Emma to bed. They're watching, Thomas said quietly. Sarah froze. Who? She asked. He did not answer. That was the moment Thomas realized he could no longer protect his family by hiding the truth. He told her enough. Not names, not details, just danger. Sarah listened without interrupting. When he finished, she nodded once. Tell me what to do, she said. That broke something in him.
Later that night, Norton returned. This time, he did not knock. He appeared in the backyard as if summoned by thought alone. They're moving faster than expected, Norton said. They brought surveillance onto my street, Thomas replied. That was a mistake. Norton studied him. Yes, he said. It was. Thomas stepped closer. You said someone was manipulating both of us. Yes. Then we stop reacting, Thomas said. We force exposure. Norton smiled faintly. That's the right instinct, he said, and the most dangerous one. The plan changed. Not a leak, a reveal. They would surface just enough truth to fracture the narrative. Not to the public, not to leadership, to rival factions inside the system. Documents, timelines, contradictions. Let paranoia do the rest. If the system tore itself apart looking for the ghost, it would lose sight of Thomas entirely. Risky, chaotic, effective. The following days blurred together. Thomas met people he should not have met, passed information through channels that should not exist anymore, trusted Norton when every instinct told him not to. And yet, the pressure eased. The cars disappeared. The emails stopped. His interview was quietly reclassified. No apology, no clearance, just silence. Silence in intelligence work was never peace. It was an unfinished sentence. 1 week later, Norton was gone. No farewell, no note. His house emptied overnight, the furniture removed, the garage bare. By morning, a realtor sign stood on the lawn. Official explanation followed within hours. William Norton had accepted a job overseas. Family emergency, sudden move. The neighborhood believed it. Sarah did not. Thomas stood at the window that night, staring at the dark house next door. The fret had vanished, but the game had not ended. It had simply moved beyond his sight. Months later, Thomas returned to work. Not to the same role, not to the same access. He accepted the change. He stayed quiet, careful. At night, he sometimes checked the attic camera feed. Nothing ever moved. Still, he kept watching. Because once you learn how easily reality can be rewritten, you never fully trust what looks calm. Maple Grove Avenue remained peaceful, but Thomas Brennan knew the truth. The quiet street was never empty. It was only waiting. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of names and files, the next move was already being prepared. Thomas tried to convince himself that this was the end, that the disappearance of William Norton was a conclusion, not a comma, that the silence meant closure. It didn't. Silence was what remained after something had learned how to hide better. Life settled into a new rhythm, a reduced role at work, fewer briefings, narrower access. No one said it out loud, but the message was clear. He was trusted just enough to be useful, not enough to be dangerous. Thomas accepted it. He had learned, painfully, that pushing back too hard only sharpened the knives. At home, things looked normal again. Sarah stopped checking the street every night. Emma returned to her routines, her world untouched by what had almost reached it. That was the victory Thomas clung to. But habits formed under pressure do not disappear easily. He still woke before dawn, still scanned reflections, still paused when he heard unfamiliar footsteps outside. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, he thought about Norton. Not as a spy, not as an enemy, as a warning. Weeks turned into months. Then one afternoon, a file appeared in Thomas's inbox. No sender, no subject line, just a reference number. He should not have been able to open it, but he could. Inside was a brief intelligence summary, classified above his current clearance. Either someone had made a mistake, or someone wanted him to read it. The report described an internal counterintelligence review. Quiet, unofficial, still ongoing. The conclusion was inconclusive. No mole identified, no single actor blamed. Instead, the report suggested systemic manipulation. uncoordinated actions converging into a false narrative, paranoia feeding paranoia, a bureaucratic way of saying no one was innocent and no one was fully guilty. At the bottom of the file was a note, one sentence: certain assets remain unaccounted for. Thomas closed the file and leaned back in his chair. Unaccounted for did not mean gone. It meant unresolved. That night, he walked past Norton's old house. The realtor's sign was gone. New curtains hung in the windows. A different car sat in the driveway. Another family, another story. No one on Maple Grove Avenue talked about William Norton anymore. That disturbed Thomas more than if they had. People forgot too easily. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. The mailbox 3 houses down. On its side, barely visible in the fading light, was a faint mark. Not blue, gray, almost erased. Thomas stood still for a long time, long enough to know he wasn't imagining it, long enough to understand what it meant. Some systems did not collapse. They adapted. Some games did not end. They changed players. Thomas walked home without touching the mailbox, without looking back. Inside, Sarah asked him how his day had been. Quiet, he said. That was the truth.
Later, after the house fell asleep, Thomas stood by the window one last time. The streetlights hummed softly. The neighborhood breathed in its steady, untroubled way. He knew now that safety was not the absence of danger. It was the ability to live beside it without being seen. Somewhere out there, someone was watching, or preparing, or waiting. And someday, perhaps years from now, another small inconsistency would surface, another hairline crack. When it did, Thomas Brennan would recognize it immediately. Because once you have seen how the quiet street really works, you never stop listening. The street would look the same, and that would be the most dangerous part. Thomas did not tell anyone about the mark, not Sarah, not his colleagues, not even himself at first. He treated it the way professionals treated unexploded ordnance. You note its existence, you mark the location, you do not touch it. Days passed. Nothing happened. No cars returned. No emails appeared. No doors knocked. That was deliberate. Whatever had left the mark wanted to be noticed, but not acknowledged. Thomas adjusted again. He stopped checking the attic camera every night. He let weeks pass between casual scans of the street. He allowed himself to be seen living normally. That was the cost of survival. One morning, while walking Emma to school, he noticed something else. The mailbox had been replaced. New metal, new paint, no mark. Someone had cleaned the board. That was confirmation. At work, Thomas was quietly reassigned again, this time sideways, not down, a role that touched methodology, not operations, teaching others how to recognize manipulation without naming its source. He understood the irony. He spoke carefully. He chose his examples from decades past. He never mentioned Maple Grove Avenue. People listened, some too closely. Years later, Thomas would realize that this was the real outcome of the game. Not victory, not exposure, containment. The system had absorbed the shock. It had learned. It had sealed the fracture without admitting it existed. William Norton never resurfaced, neither did Yuri Vulov, or anyone resembling them. But from time to time, Thomas would hear rumors, fragments passed in hallways, names that appeared briefly and vanished again, files that closed without explanation. He never chased them. That was another lesson learned. Late one evening, long after Emma had grown older and the street had changed hands again, Thomas stood by the window and looked out. Nothing moved. The quiet was complete. And for the first time, he understood what the game had always been about. Not secrets, not nations, not even loyalty. Control. Control of narratives, of fear, of who was allowed to ask questions. Thomas turned off the light and stepped away from the window. Tomorrow, the street would look the same. It always did. And somewhere, unseen, someone would be watching it, just as he once had. The game did not end. It never needed to. It only needed people willing to believe that it had.
There was one last thing Thomas never wrote down, not in a notebook, not in a report, not even in his own thoughts. It was a rule. Once you see the mechanism, you do not fight it head-on. You do not expose it. You do not try to win. You learn how to live beside it. Years passed. Maple Grove Avenue aged. Trees grew taller.
New families arrived, old ones left. The street kept doing what it had always done. It pretended nothing important had ever happened there. Thomas grew older too, quieter, less visible. He became the kind of man people forgot to notice. That was intentional. Every now and then, somewhere far from his home, a familiar pattern surfaced, a file that made too much sense, a life that fit together too cleanly, a question that disappeared instead of being answered. Thomas never followed those threads. He no longer needed to. Because the most dangerous part of the game was not the spy, not the handler, not even the system. It was the moment someone believed the story was finished. One evening, standing in the kitchen, Thomas watched Emma, older now, laugh at something on her phone. Ordinary life, unbroken. He felt something close to peace, not safety, peace, the kind that comes from understanding the limits of control. Outside, the streetlights came on, one by one, casting the same familiar shadows they always had. Somewhere, someone else was learning the rules for the first time. Not here, not now, but soon. Thomas turned away from the window. The quiet street remained quiet, and that was exactly how the game preferred it. Nothing followed. No message, no mark, no signal. And that absence was the final confirmation, because real endings never announce themselves. Thomas settled fully into the version of life that required the least explanation. He did his job well enough to be respected, poorly enough to be ignored. He avoided ambition, avoided visibility. He taught, he advised, he warned in abstract terms, never specifics. At home, years stacked quietly on top of one another. Birthdays, school milestones, small arguments that mattered more than any briefing ever had. Sarah never asked again. She understood without needing language. That too was a kind of intelligence. Sometimes, very late at night, Thomas would stand by the window, not searching, just observing, letting the street exist without meaning. No hedges out of place, no unusual cars, no shadows where there should not be shadows. He learned to accept that calm did not mean innocence, only balance. The world beyond the street continued to turn. Crises appeared, disappeared. New threats replaced old ones. Names changed, structures rebranded. The mechanism remained. One night, long after Maple Grove Avenue had stopped feeling like a place and started feeling like a memory, Thomas realized something else. He had not survived because he was smarter, or stronger, or more ruthless. He survived because he stopped trying to be right. He stopped trying to win. He understood when to become quiet. That was the lesson no training ever taught. The street outside his window stayed still. The light hummed. The night held its shape. Somewhere else, another quiet place existed. Another normal street. Another perfect neighbor. The game would begin again. Not loudly, not violently, but patiently. Thomas Brennan turned off the light and went to bed. And the quiet street remained exactly what it had always been. A place where nothing ever happens. Until it does.
Years later, Thomas would struggle to remember the exact moment the street stopped feeling dangerous, not because it became safe, but it became familiar. Danger, when it stays long enough, loses its sharp edges. He never saw another mark, never received another file, never heard Norton's name spoken again in any context that mattered. And that was the point. The system did not reward exposure. It rewarded equilibrium. Thomas remained where he was, useful, inconvenient only in theory. A man whose past was complicated enough to discourage curiosity, but clean enough to avoid suspicion. That balance protected him better than truth ever could. One afternoon, years after everything had faded into routine, Thomas drove through a different neighborhood on his way home. Another quiet street, another set of identical houses, another man watering his lawn with practiced indifference. For a brief moment, Thomas felt the old instinct stir. Then he let it go, because he understood now what he had not understood before. Not every signal was meant for him. Not every anomaly required action. Not every game needed a player who remembered the rules. Survival, in the end, was not about vigilance. It was about restraint. Thomas turned onto Maple Grove Avenue as the sun dipped low. The street greeted him the way it always had. Calm, unremarkable, forgettable, perfect. He parked the car, walked inside, closed the door behind him,
And somewhere far beyond the reach of this place, the mechanism continued its quiet work, unseen, unnamed, unchallenged, just the way it preferred.